Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to an uncompromising approach to UX and Scrum. Webinar is going to last about, let's say 35 minutes. Lynn's just set our timer, which is great. Our UX specialist.
My favorite tool.
Exactly. So it should be 35 minutes. There'll be an option for questions and answers at the end. Actually, on your go-to sort of gizmo there on your screen, there is a window there where you can actually put in questions. If you type them in, if you've got any, we will save them all up and answer them at the end. If we don't have enough time to answer the questions, we will write to you with a follow-up with some of those answers there. So do fire your questions in. You are on mute, so you can't shout at us. We won't be able to hear you, but certainly type away and we will be able to see your questions. Okay, so introductions. First, eCity Interactive. We are part of a larger media group. Center City Film and Video is our sister company, the largest film production company in Philadelphia. Variant VR is our virtual reality arm, and Stage 3 Production does all our original content. But we are a digital agency that puts user research and design thinking at the heart of our client solutions. I'm Kevin Renton, I'm one of the managing directors, and I have with me
Lynn Martin, I'm the director of UX strategy.
Fantastic. Our agenda today, a brief history of Agile and UX. We're going to blow through that. We're assuming that most product managers or people on the call are going to have a good understanding of that, the importance of a validated market need, and then the discovery phase and design sprints, and the delivery phase and testing iterations. And we're going to find out how Lynn is going to be uncompromising in her approach. So Lynn, let's jump back to the history and the problem. And what was it about waterfall that was so bad? Get us right back to the start.
Oh, it's painful, Kevin. I don't know if I want to go back to the 90s, but sadly I was there, dating myself a bit now. And yeah, it was not an effective process for a couple of main reasons. This slide is trying to show that. The main problem is this development gap that would occur, where release cycles were sometimes even measured in years in those days. You would define what the product was going to be, get agreement with the client on that, and then as time would pass, new requirements would inevitably creep in, customer needs would change. Then on the development side of things, you could have unexpected technical constraints or misinterpretation of the requirements by individual engineers. So at the end of the day, the product that was delivered to the customer had now diverged significantly from what their current needs were. So it became obvious that developing software had to change. The way we did things had to become more agile and responsive to the changing customer needs.
Share some of the horror stories.
Oh, well,
something that nobody uses.
Oh, yeah, it's horrible. And then one of the real horrors is that once you've made that massive technical investment, now you have this code base that exists and has years of engineering effort, to create it. And now to refactor that can be significant. I mean, it can be almost a do-over. So at least in my experience, it was painfully obvious that a lack of continuous customer involvement was the main problem there.
So Agile came into the horizon. The principles?
Yeah, so the Agile Manifesto came out, I think it was like early 2001, and it has like 12 core principles. But I think the main thing about it is that customer satisfaction has to be the highest priority. And the way that it's achieved is through emergent design and continuous involvement with the customer. Small autonomous teams working incrementally to deliver value. And there are many Agile frameworks that arose around this time that all were founded on those core principles.
Yeah, so there was a number. There was Extreme, Canvas, Lean.
Extreme programming was the first one I got to see, and that was just so obviously cool. I mean, the paired programming and the way they were sort of dividing up and conquering in small stories, small user stories of the work at hand just meant it was going to be much more flexible. Because in the old days, I can remember architects would be working away on Java code for like 2 weeks before they'd check something in.
Yeah.
It's just, horrible, right? So the continuous delivery and integration, obviously all of DevOps, a huge support for Agile teams as well. But yeah, it's just made an incredible difference between the 90s and today, the way products are built.
So we're kind of in this, we're going to focus on Scrum.
Yeah, it's the most popular of the Agile frameworks, and I'm sure that most everyone on the call is familiar, so I won't spend a lot of time on this. But it shows what the Scrum process is and what the key elements are. So there's a product backlog, which is just features and defects that need to be addressed to bring the product to market. Then you go through a phase of sprint planning, and you reduce to just what the backlog is going to be for that sprint. And then the sprint itself is 1 to 4 weeks. I think 2 weeks is most common, from what I understand. And that's what we used to do when I was working as a UXD on sprint teams in the past anyways. So then that week or 2 weeks work is done by the team. Then you have a demo or sprint review to show what that increment has accomplished. And the increment is, the intent there is that it is product of value, that, you know, every sprint cycle, you're delivering something of value in a product increment. And then there's a retrospective that happens after every sprint where teams can identify things that could have been improved upon, and then wash, rinse, and repeat. Right?
Cool. And this is when we start to look at some of the problems or some of the highlights. And we mentioned, like, how does design and user feedback then get into the Scrum process or framework that you just mentioned?
And that's the rub, right? And I mean, honestly, people really struggle to do this effectively. Why? Because research and design take longer. And so trying to align them to a very short 1 or 2 week sprint is excruciatingly painful. It can be, at least, because you think of the activities that one has to do for any new feature as a UX designer, right? You may want to be questioning product management's understanding of that requirement, making sure that it's based on something valid, so there might be some research that is needed to do there. Then you have the actual design, testing, feedback, delivery, and communication to the development team, and you're supposed to do that in a sprint, like before the sprint where the feature is being developed. And then you think about testing that you want to do after the fact when something ships. It's also a good idea to usability test that, right? So particularly in new product development, which is really what we're focusing on in this webinar, it can be very, very painful to align UX to Scrum without making sacrifices. Yeah.
So you're speaking there about UX research, testing within the Scrum process. But then I guess the elephant in the room then is even how are you picking backlog? How are you picking the user stories? And this is probably your next slide. It's got to go in it.
Yes. So, I mean, Scrum is fantastic, right? Emergent design, obviously, very intelligent approach to developing something of quality incrementally. It simply works. But one thing that Scrum or any Agile process in and of itself can accomplish is telling you which problem you're trying to solve in the first place, right? So, you know, knowing that there is a market need for what the product is that you're about to develop is obviously a crucial thing that has to happen beforehand. Yeah.
So some of the things, like, you've got different Scrum teams then, and again, in this user research, we spoke about yesterday about Scrum teams doing inconsistencies or, you know, emerging. Give me a bit of background about that.
Right, okay, so yeah, another part of the problem is that even at this late date, UX teams are oftentimes understaffed, and the ratio of UXD to developer is poor. So, you know, the best situation is that you have a UXD on all of your front-end Scrum teams, so that they're able to contribute and be a full member of that team. But that's not always the case. And if you don't have UXDs represented on multiple Scrum teams, and you have front-end teams that are working on, say, different components of a product solution or different parts of the UI, they're going to have similar problems to solve. And if there isn't some type of oversight, then it's quite likely that those two, say, front-end devs are going to solve a similar problem in different ways. Yeah. And in this way, you end up introducing inconsistencies in the UI, which makes it difficult to use the product, to remember how to use it. It becomes a frustration. That's pain I've seen happen over and over again. Yeah. So
two major pains there. One, you pick the wrong problem. Two, you have inconsistencies and you build a bad product.
Yeah.
The first one, picking the wrong problem, that probably has more of a catastrophic effect if you do this.
Right. I mean, and this, okay, so this slide is from the last webinar we did on design sprints, right? And this is based on a study of, you know, startups that failed, right? But I think it's also...
Products.
Exactly, it's relevant here as well. So the main reason that startups went belly up, the ones that were studied here, is because they built something that no one actually needed, which just blew my mind when I read that statistic, right? I mean, it really points to, it doesn't matter how well you've aligned your UX to your Scrum if you're building something that people don't want.
Well, waterfall leads you down this path. That's the thing going back there.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is you need a strategy that's driven by design, understanding of the user needs, as well as an agile approach. And it's bringing these three things together that will hopefully lead to success. And that's what we're talking about, design strategy or design thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I threw this slide in here because I really wanted to talk a bit about, more than just product design.
Yeah.
That I think what's being recognized now is that design, like Scrum and Agile, is incredibly inclusive, and it has a real strong impact on overall business strategy, right? Okay. And so that your UX practice can do more than just functional innovation and interaction design, right? So if you look at these three circles, it all begins with that market need and desirability. Yeah. The other two underpinnings for a design strategy are technical feasibility, and then business viability. So technical feasibility just meaning, we have the skills in-house and the technology exists to do what we're envisioning. Business viability, there's not somebody out there already who has the ideal solution.
So if I want to make a mobile phone, you're saying to me, Kevin, there's a big company out there that makes really good mobile phones.
Right. So the technology might exist and it might be something people want, but there's no viable business opportunity. Yeah. So where these three things intersect gets interesting, because that's when you talk about true design innovation, I feel. So, functional innovation, that's the intersection of technical feasibility and desirability, right? That's where your front-end patents come from. That's where your innovative UI arises, from the intersection of those two things. And then if you think about desirability and business viability, where they intersect, that's opportunities for brand innovation, how you tell your story, why you do what you do, how you communicate that. And then process innovation, so like we were talking before about DevOps, that's kind of the intersection of technical feasibility and business viability, right? You can have new processes that come out of the intersection of those two things that enable how you do what you do.
Yeah, I was thinking last night when I was looking at the slide, I was thinking of where did Theranos fit into that?
Where did what fit into it?
Theranos, the company, the medical company out in the West Coast, there was a documentary made about it. It was a big documentary about it, but moving on then, so companies that do this, what are the benefits then of taking this design approach? What happens to these companies, or how do they perform?
And this is also a pretty impressive slide, but instead of being impressive in a bad way, it's showing that, companies that are truly design driven, they outperform the S&P by well over 200%. And if you look at the companies that are listed there, we're not talking about software development exclusively, or even technology, really. It's all over the board in terms of the verticals there. So I think what this is pointing to is that, people or companies that take a design innovation approach to their business strategy ultimately yield some very tangible business results.
I agree, I agree with you. Lots of different sectors. You've got like Apple in there, Stairwood, Nike, varied industries. What's stopping companies, or what do you find as the things that stops people getting design thinking into their product company?
They don't know how to do it. They don't know where to begin. They don't know how to start. And they've been doing waterfall classic UX and trying to struggle to align that to an agile process with only limited success. There's still room for classic UX and individuals to function as an end-to-end UXer in companies, right? But the trend is going towards specialization. So as any discipline matures, you go from seeing a lot of generalists to seeing very specific roles, information architects and researchers versus interaction designers and the like. So things are moving in the right direction, but still companies are struggling with what does that UX team look like, staffing it adequately so that the ratio of UXer to developer is solid, and then figuring out exactly what we're going to talk about next, which is how do you align that? What activities do you do at the right time, and particularly around new product development?
Cool. Okay, so first chapter then, teams have struggled to align Scrum and UX in a way that enables them to be truly design-driven. Scrum and emergent design alone can't tell you what problem to solve, so there's a big risk there. And then conducting initial discovery phase, including design sprints, validates the market need. Experiments with design, validates the product backlog prior to an iterative delivery phase, is an uncompromising approach that works.
That long-winded sentence.
I got there.
That long-winded sentence is what the rest of this deck is about, and it's talking about something that will probably irritate Agile purists that may be on the call, in that an initial discovery phase sure sounds like big design up front. But what I'm trying to suggest here is that when you're doing new product development, to use your UX resources wisely and to consider validating that original product concept and product backlog through some research and testing.
Cool.
This would be done normally during like a concept and plan phase.
Why did you use the word uncompromising?
Because if you're only doing Agile UX or trying to do Agile UX, you're going to compromise. You're not going to do you're not going to have time in any individual sprint to do everything that you need to do, right? So in my opinion, having spent years trying to do purely just Agile UX with insufficient resources, it's not going to work.
Oh, okay. This is your solution. From a high, we're going to talk from a high level, and then we'll break it down into different parts of the discovery phase, and then the delivery, track 1 and track 2. So, from a high level. Yeah, because you know me, I'll go down a rabbit hole in a heartbeat. So just pull me out if I can. So, I mean, this isn't going to look like anything too novel, I'm sure, to most folks on the call, and that the double diamond has been around for quite a while, which is what we're calling here the discovery phase. And then it's followed by a dual track Scrum delivery phase. And this approach is suggesting that discovery phase can be right-sized. But in most new product development scenarios, you're going to be doing something. Even if you're doing a single week's design sprint to validate your product concept, or it could be a more protracted classic UX approach where you really need to do some in-depth user research like surveys and interviews and contextual observations to create your personas. It really all depends upon how well the business and the product management team understands the problem space and the user, how much effort you put there. So that double diamond there, that's taking you from don't know, could be, do know, should be. And you're saying that could be 1 week, 6 months, 9 months, depending on what the problem is. Depending on what the problem is, depending on the scope and complexity of the solution that's being built. And so it can vary, the approach that you take. And that's what I'm trying to make is the case for, there is still in some cases a place for classic UX to be applied, which you can think of as being a waterfall process actually, right? But only if during your actual implementation, your delivery phase, you're complementing that with Lean UX or Agile UX at the same time. Cool. Because Lean UX, you wouldn't have this double diamond unless it was Lean UX. Well, you kind of would. I mean, Lean UX is all about having a hypothesis, right, and then testing a prototype. So the main difference between Lean UX and Agile UX, like Lean UX evolved from Lean Startup, if you're familiar with that book, and it's more on its own timeline. It doesn't necessarily align with each sprint cycle as cleanly. Agile UX is an attempt to do exactly that. So this diagram here graphically is suggesting more of an Agile approach, but that is not to say that if you're staffed well from a UX perspective, that when a new feature opportunity comes along throughout the development process, that you can't be doing Lean UX in tandem, right? You could go and do a design sprint on a new feature at any point in this process. Cool. So deeper dive here into your discovery phase. Yeah, so this is, again, the double diamond of diverging and converging on research and then synthesizing your results so that at the end of that first diamond, you have a document library that enables the entire product development team, personas, user journey maps, scenarios, task flows, and the like. So it's all about discovery and then converging on a summarization of your findings. And then the second diamond is where you're doing your design ideation, and followed by prototyping and testing in an iterative fashion. So, and a design sprint actually condenses this type of approach, a design thinking approach, into 1 week team exercise. So I know we spoke in the past, new experience different sections, different diamonds, flexible depending on the problem.
Yep.
Like there's sometimes it requires more research, sometimes like where have you found to be differences then when you tackle?
So it's really one of scope and complexity. So for example, I worked on product redesign, so not new product development, but complete product refactoring.
Okay.
Where there was a back-end kind of administrative console, and then more of a front-end dashboard runtime kind of console. And each of those teams had dedicated front-end Scrum teams, right? But it was important to think about how those two were going to holistically exist. And you had to have someone with UX oversight who had a design vision with product management to say, how are these two things going to function? If you didn't, then they would evolve as separate lives, if you will, and their front-end interaction would vary significantly. And when we tried to bring the two together, it wouldn't be a cohesive kind of single pane of glass experience. And you see that happening all the time because, you divide and conquer across your Scrum teams on a product, right? Multiple UIs, multiple functional areas of the product, makes sense to do that. But for ensuring that you have solid design direction, someone needs to be doing this across the product.
You mentioned that. You mentioned it a couple of times, design sprints, and you floated this idea that this could be from 1 week to 6 months.
Yeah.
We've been doing design sprints. Talk us through a design sprint and what this is, because really it's still doing that process, that double diamond condensed.
It is. What's cool about a design sprint, although it doesn't have exhaustive upfront user research like a more classic UX approach might have, they're really good for taking a multidisciplinary team, spending 1 short week to map out the problem, including asking internal experts and stakeholders for their opinion, then quickly ideating design solutions as a team, but you're doing it individually through these time box exercises that really get out the most from your team in terms of design concepts. And then there's also, what I love about design sprints is they're just a very highly efficient decision process that eliminates the usual debate and grandstanding and sales pitches that you can get in this type of product kickoff meeting. Usually those multi-day meetings are a nightmare, at least the old style, where this cuts right through all of that and allows an authoritative decision maker to, informed by the opinions of the team, make a clear decision on what we're going to prototype and test. And then you do that, and by the end of the week, you've tested a prototype, realistic prototype, with 5 actual users. So you can gain an incredible amount of knowledge, and the knowledge you gain might be that your design idea is long. That your product that you're thinking of building is not going to meet a market need. It's a huge win because otherwise you could have gone down months or if not years down the wrong path.
Meeting that in a week, you're still going from don't know could be to by then being do know.
Yeah. The difference is scope again. So so let's say you're doing a massive product refactoring. You're not going to do a single sprint to address that, right? You're going to take one manageable chunk of that you can prototype and test in a week. So doing sprints whenever it makes sense to do so, it can be super valuable.
So whether you're doing a bigger discovery phase or you're doing design sprint, ultimate goal then is product backlog.
Yeah, you want to validate a backlog. I mean,
validate backlog. Yeah. Then you're going into delivery, and this is your dual track.
Yeah. So there's different ways that teams approach this that I've seen. We sort of touched already upon one way, which is Agile UX. And so in that scenario, you're staying 1 sprint ahead of the development team, and you are a UXD that is a member of that Scrum team. So you're very well aligned to their cadence and what their sprint backlog is every sprint. So if there are any gaps, so let's say you're doing lean UX and you're sprinting and you're experimenting with prototypes. Now the Scrum team, is actually going to be implementing this specific feature. There might be some design direction gaps. So when you do a prototype in lean UX, you're not able to fully develop that prototype, right? You're testing a single pass through. So it as an artifact alone isn't necessarily complete design direction for that development team. So sometimes doing some annotated wireframes can really bridge that gap. And so I still see that as being something, a form of UX documentation that's oftentimes required. The one thing you absolutely cannot do is hold up the velocity of your team,
well, that's
right?
the thing. You mentioned right at the start of the webinar that, the design research takes more time than the dev team.
Yeah.
So in this, the design...
You need design oversight and a UX strategy that will be able to work with product management, which could be a whole other webinar, by the way, how you align to the roadmap, how UX informs that roadmap, how you are brought in early into the process. I mean, nowadays, UX has a seat at the table equal to product management and development. That wasn't always the case. But now, you're going to be, assuming you have executive level support for UX in your company, you're going to be brought into the table as a UX lead early in that process. So whatever research is required to validate things in a broad stroke, you're doing that in your discovery phase, right? And then as you're seeing the sprint backlog get rejiggered every sprint, you're one sprint ahead at least, seeing, okay, this is what they're going to be working against. Any design gaps I need to close now. And if I need to do any research validation, I need to do it the sprint before. So it's a challenge.
Yeah.
You're slipstreaming UX in and staying one sprint ahead of your Scrum team in every sprint.
So the UX team in their sprint cycle at the top here, they're testing the sprint from the Scrum team from before and researching for the next sprint.
Potentially. I mean, I've seen some teams that approach it that way. Like sometimes there can be, unfortunately, a gap between the design and what is actually delivered. It happens, right? If you really are buttoned up and you have good UX direction, it's less likely. But it can occur so that what's delivered does not match the design. And in those cases, in particular, you're going to want to get users' hands on that. So the previous sprint product increment, you're going to want to test that with early access customers or beta customers or whomever it is that you've lined up.
I want to jump back. What does this team look like? Like who's in it? How many people are in it?
There's no limit really, but the optimal size is like 5 to 7, and that's what I've seen most commonly, which is interesting because it's the same size as a design sprint, right? But anyway, 5 to 7, and usually it's primarily front-end developers, a QA person, the product owners, Scrum Master, and a designer. Hopefully you have enough designers to have one on every Scrum team.
And so is that Scrum team doing both these sprints, or is it 2 teams? Is there
It's two dual tracks, 2 teams.
Okay.
So the research that might be required, for example, might be done by a UX researcher on your UX team, where a UXD, who is more of a end-to-end UXer, might be the person that's assigned to the Scrum team. It's kind of up to you and the resources that you have in terms of where to put the bodies. But there may be ongoing research activities that are happening outside of the sprint proper, if you will. Or maybe in 2 sprints, we're going to do this mapping feature, and we haven't even really begun to think about that other than we see some competitive examples. We know our users want it. We have a set of requirements for it, but we really haven't thought about this in any detail at all. We've picked the technology we think is best, but we should go do a sprint on that now. So a design sprint is going to happen outside of the construct of the Scrum team itself. Members of the Scrum team might participate in that sprint. Members of product management certainly will, and hopefully the CEO or some people on the executive team will participate as well. So yeah, there's a sort of a UX cadence that is overarching and outside of the Scrum cadence.
So the cadence is going, the Scrum team's going along, the design teams, and you alluded there where you might go off and do sprints. How do you recognize that there's a problem? Okay, it's not going to fit into this normal workflow. We've got a bigger problem, or there's a bigger opportunity. And then what do? You sprint again, go out research, do you stop this team?
No, you don't stop. The team is always off and running, right? They have their backlog to work against. The way the flexibility of Scrum is built in is that the product owner can then introduce new requirements, defects as they are discovered, and reorder that backlog, groom the backlog such that the team is now working on what's most important in any given sprint. What UX is doing is recognizing those opportunities when there's a need for additional research. There's a hypothesis here that hasn't been tested. And the one thing you don't want to do is to bake a key feature into a product without validating first that your approach is good. And any amount of testing is better than none. So even if you're really strapped for UX resources and time, which we know happens, right? Even doing quick and dirty internal usability testing of a prototype is much better than doing nothing. And the good news is, certainly you see this in design sprints, you don't need 50 users. You get 3 to 5 bodies in front of it. 5 is the magic number. You'll get 80% of your issues discovered. Then you can iterate on that design and hand it off to development. You know, you think of a handoff to development as something that's to be avoided, like, because it implies you're throwing something over the wall. That's why it's so important that you have an integrated UX team that is doing some form of Agile UX in tandem, is always aware of what the Scrum team is working on in every sprint.
Cool, but it's working well.
Oh, it's, to be totally honest, I haven't had the pleasure for a protracted period of time, but I would say when it's working well, in my experience, when you've got enough bodies that you feel like you're not compromising on the research, that you don't have front-end developers that are forced to answer their own design decision questions. And, you know, I think where the future is headed is that we're going to find more and more UX developers, which I know 10 years ago would have sounded like an oxymoron to folks in my field, right? But hey, these lines are blurring.
Let's get back to that concept that everyone's a designer.
Yeah, right?
You know.
Design thinking can be applied to any creative problem, right? So as we've said with design innovation, it can inspire innovation in areas other than just the front-end design. So the way we approach our business problems, elements of design sprints, the decision-making process, and the ideation exercises can be used in other areas of the business to improve how we function.
Okay, so recap, here's your model again.
Yeah, I mean, the duration of that discovery phase is very flexible. There's a million different exercises and activities that can take place during that discovery phase. But the point is, you want to have some stab at validating a new product's backlog. It's not that over time, with just doing Agile or Lean UX and Scrum, that you wouldn't ultimately arrive at a really solid design. It's just, if you're building something brand spanking new, validate that problem space, get as much design direction as you can so that your UX team has an easier time of over the sprint cycle, working and staying aligned with your development team so that they're not creating a roadblock and that they're not compromising on their UX research and testing.
Cool. And then it's when you go into the delivery phase, it's dual track. It's like consistently testing, consistently going in and getting user feedback. And if you hit an opportunity that's bigger or feels too big for that 2-week window, go back to your discovery phase, wherever that looks like, 1 week, 2 weeks, and try and sprint or do a more in-depth.
Exactly. And so you're really tightly aligned not only to the Scrum team and the development organization, but to the product management team and the product roadmap and what that backlog is as well. Oftentimes, it's through UX research and through directly observing customers interacting with the product in the context of their environment, seeing what other tools they're using, that you will see this completely untapped need that hasn't even arisen to the top of the customer's mind yet, because they're so ingrained in doing things the way they've always done it. So UX and UX research can be a huge contributor to product strategy. And that could be the topic for us. Exactly, right. That's how product innovation occurs, right? It's really cool. So your developers and your PMs should be participating in that research as much as possible.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay, key takeaways then. Scrum, emergent design, not enough to drive design innovation. We need a discovery phase, it's necessary, ensure that there's a market need for the product as envisioned, and define the design vision and product backlog. Design sprints can be a great tool to accelerate this. It doesn't need to be a 3-week, 3-month. We can do design sprints in a week. And then in the delivery phase, dual track Scrum keeps discovery as an ongoing part of the process. You're still finding opportunities, still finding features, still testing. And dual track enables the teams to become true design innovators and realize the positive business outcomes of the results. It's going back to those companies that are performing so well. Then you can get this process, your product is going to get fuel injected because you're getting the needs of the customer and you're providing what they want.
One thing I meant to mention and I didn't is that even design sprints can be shorter than a week. A lot of times what happens is that once you have done this repeatedly, you can execute a 3-day sprint. So, you can just very quickly iterate some designs and test them in a couple of days. So that's also another flavor that you can introduce into this. And if anybody on the call wants to learn more about design sprints, we just actually launched a subdomain. So it's design sprint in the singular .ecityinteractive.com. And I think the last webinar we did is there, a couple of blog posts and just some general information on design sprints. So check it out.
Yeah, we'll send it out to everybody and follow up email with the questions and answers. So I guess that the next part is Q&A, questions here.
Okay, so I think when we were talking about product management and UX and how that could be another webinar on its own, I just want to make sure that, because this was a conversation so much about aligning UX to dev, right, that I really want to make the point that it's equal involvement with product as well. Not just in terms of collaborating with them, but actually helping to drive what the product becomes. So that's just one important point I wanted to call out. In terms of any questions, do we have anything that comes to mind? Because it looks like we don't have a lot of questions that were entered in.
One of the questions is, if you don't have a UX team, what should you do, or how do you build that UX capability?
Right. So, I mean, fortunately, the way things are moving is that design thinking itself is evolving to something that is broadly understood, and design is much more inclusive, right? It used to be the domain of the designer.
Yeah.
That is no longer the case, and UX developers are springing up as a job title all over the place, right? Which is so cool. And that comes from aligning them to the principles of design thinking. So I would just say that the best way is to sprint, do a design sprint, because that is going to show you the value of design thinking in a really condensed way. And it should be inclusive of the people that are actually building the product.
Cool. Got a question here. In an ideal world, how many Agile teams should one UX designer be embedded into?
Agile world, how many? So ideally, you want one UX designer per Scrum team.
Okay.
Because if you don't have that, at least that degree of coverage, you're really going to have a hard time in having some kind of overarching view of what's happening in the front end development across the whole product interface. Yeah, I hope that answers that question.
Another one here. Do you see UXD as a stakeholder, UX developer?
UXD is usually, I don't know if they mean dev or designer.
Yeah.
Probably designer in that kind. Do I see them as a stakeholder?
I guess I asked the questions like, in the past, it's designer, says Tim.
Oh, okay.
UX designer as a stakeholder. I guess that's the question. It's an interesting question. In the past, the product backlog was owned by the product manager. And where's that relationship? Is the UX designer starting getting into?
Well, there's a blurring line, as there is with design and development, there is with UX and product management as well. Honestly, you're seeing the need. If you read the job descriptions for product managers, the modern job description is going to include, obviously, an understanding of user-centered design principles. So there's a blur there.
Yeah. And
I know plenty of UXers that have actually crossed over into product management and vice versa. Anyone who is a good PM these days is going to have to be conversant and understand Agile and Lean as it relates to UX research and design. Absolutely. Cool. Because that's how the product evolves over time. So UX and UX design and research is a key contributor to product strategy in that way. So that line gets blurred a little bit, I think, which is cool. It's a cool thing that that's happening.
Nico came back on the previous question.
What?
Can one UX designer be embedded into multiple Agile teams?
Oh, no. Okay, no. You shouldn't have the same person on multiple teams, just because they're going to be spread way too thin. Okay. So if you're, in general, Scrum teams, like, that's ill-advised, right? Okay. You don't want the same front-end dev on multiple Scrum teams either. Okay. So, it's a matter of spreading someone too thin, You do need to have some type of, in your UX department, you have multiple UX designers on different Scrum teams, you have to have someone who's pulling that all together, and you have to have some type of ability to check in and to have a consistent UX strategy across the board, and to have a design system that is informed by all of that work that enables all of the front-end teams. But yeah, you don't want to have one person try to handle more than one Scrum team if you can possibly help it.
Sounds good. Any other questions? I think, oh, extremely helpful, thank you. Thanks, guys. We're going to wind up here. Enjoy your lunch. Lynn and I are going to run off now and
eat our lunch.
But yeah, thanks for joining us today. It's been fun putting this together. If you'd like any more, we will send you an email. We'll send you an email with the link to a new microsite on design sprints. We have there's other content on there that you might feel really or think that's helpful. We are going to run more in this webinar series, so we're looking forward to seeing everybody. Thanks for your questions and thanks for joining us.
And there's going to be an opportunity to do like a really short, like 2-minute survey at the end of this. And one of the questions there is what topics you'd be interested in hearing us discussing going forward. So please, if you have a moment, complete that, and that would be really helpful.
Cool. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.